I'd like to talk to you today about territory. I believe that God has territory for every believer. In fact, I believe He's got it ahead of time, put aside and put it for you, for your pleasure, for your enjoyment. And as I've been meditating on territory, I've looked at the life of Abram, and I've watched to see how God shared with him the territory, the promises, and the dreams that God had for him, and how Abram had to step into it and walk into it. And as I've done that, I've come across 12 requirements of territory. The territory that God has for you will require something of you. The first territory requirement is the requirement of obedience. When God approached Abram, He said for him to get up, to rise up, and to get out of his tent. And Abram had to obey what God said. So the first thing I see is that territory requires obedience. You'll never enter the territory that God has for you if you do not walk in obedience to what He said. I also see that territory requires movement. It requires you moving. Abram had to move from where he was to where God wanted to take him. Territory requires movement. Territory requires believing. It says that Abram believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. Do you believe that God has territory for you? Has God shown you a picture of the territory that He has for you? And do you believe Him? Believing is crucial, critical in experiencing and walking in the territory that God has for you. I see a couple more things with respect to territory and the requirements. Territory requires you. God told Abram, He says, I've got territory for you. Abram had to walk and leave those areas, but he had to experience it. It was for Abram to experience and to see. So territory, God has territory for you. It requires you. It requires effort. It requires commitment. It requires your going after it. I also see in conjunction with that and in line with that, not only is there territory that is required of you, but it also requires God. Don't do it alone. If God gives you the dream, He's going to be with you through it and all the way to experience it. So territory not only requires you, but it also requires God. Never leave Him out of the equation. Never do it without Him. Territory requires you. Territory requires God. Territory requires seeing. Abram had to come out of his tent and see. But not only did he have to see, but he had to look up. The territory that God has for you isn't the territory necessarily that you might see yourself in, but you have to lift up your eyes and you have to see beyond where you are to see the territory that God has for you. Territory also requires imagination. Not only do you have to see it, but can you imagine it? Can you imagine living there? Can you imagine experiencing it? Can you imagine walking in those areas of influence, of anointing, of strength, of power? Can you imagine walking into those natural areas? Can you imagine walking into those spiritual things that God has for you? The territory that He has for you, the territory for you requires seeing and it requires imagination. It also requires contending. You have to go after it. You have to contend for it. It says, fight the good fight of faith. There are elements in your territory that you're going to have to fight for, that you're going to have to go after. Abram had to dig wells, and he had to dig again, and he had to go after those areas that God had for him. I believe God's got territory for you, and one of the requirements is you need to contend for it. You need to believe it, you need to see it, you need to imagine it, and then you need to contend for it. Another couple things that territory requires, it requires you walking. It needs you to walk. God told Abram after He said to stand up and to see, He said, I want you to walk about the territory. Before he got to his territory, he had to walk his territory. He had to take it for a test drive. You'll never recognize the territory you're in unless you've been there and you've checked it out. People test drive vehicles. people go to a house and look at a house ahead of time. What is the territory that God has for you? If it's for healing, go around somebody that's a healing ministry. Recognize healing. See how it's done. Start to experience it. Then you will know, and when you walk towards that territory, you'll be able to recognize it. So it requires walking. Before you get to your territory, you already have to walk it. Territory also requires leaving. Abram had to leave where he was in order to get where he was going. He could not stay where he was to get where he was going. That's number 10. Number 11 of the requirements of territory is that it requires not only that you're leaving, but that you have to leave things. You not only are you leaving an area, but there's some things that will not go with you into your new territory. You can't bring old habits. You can't bring minimal thinking, negative thinking into the territory that God has for you that's positive, that's large, that's huge, because then you'll never see it. You'll never experience it because your mind isn't where the territory is. So not only does it require you leaving, but it requires that some things do not come with you. The territory that I'm going to requires that there's other things I'm leaving. And the last thing that I see about territory is that it requires a future. And I would even suggest to you, not only does it require a future, it demands a future. It demands a future. Otherwise, it's not really territory. It's just a vacation that you get to enjoy. But when you go for territory, you're going for you, for your children, for your children's children, your children's children's children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Territory demands a future. So when you look at territory, take thought of these 12 things. It requires obedience, movement, believing. It requires you. It requires God. It requires seeing. It requires imagination. It requires contending. It requires walking. It requires leaving. It requires letting things go. And it demands a future.